Alright, YouTube, it's been a long time since I've done any material at all on drugs. Of course, for those of you who don't know, who joined my channel after this material was removed, I used to upload many videos with trip reports and information about psychedelics, about marijuana, about essentially all substances that I had tried, which was a vast array. I used most of the psychedelics that people generally use. I used quite a few substances in my time. I haven't used any drugs in several years now, and I don't intend to go back to doing them. I have no real craving to do so. Partially, again, because of my overdose, I don't know how I would react to them, and partially because most of these substances, as I myself found out, really don't have an addiction potential. Like things like mushrooms or LSD, even marijuana for most people, these simply aren't addictive substances. They're listed as addictive. They're Schedule A. They're listed as highly toxic, highly addictive. People will abuse them. There's other criminal behaviors that they imagine are associated with their use. When the majority of people who do get arrested for drug crimes, they're only getting arrested for drug possession. They're not dealing drugs. They're not really doing anything. All they're doing is sitting at home smoking pot. And here's a CNN article in the description, which is the main topic of this video. Does smoking pot cause man boobs? It's from CNN. And when I saw it, I laughed because this is purely, you can tell, this is simply a continuation of the anti-drug propaganda that has been around in this country since the early 1900s, before the prohibition movement against these substances, which started with reefer madness in the 1920s and culminated in the 50s and 60s with sweeping new regulations on all other substances. Before that, nobody in this country had any real problem with others using mind-altering substances. People used to use opiates on a regular basis. They smoked marijuana on a regular basis. This is literally tied with the alcohol prohibition movement. The difference is this: the majority of the population of the country at the time was drinking. Drinking was, in many cases, the only real form of entertainment a lot of people had. So there was huge outcry about alcohol prohibition. There was never nearly as much outcry, though, about these other substances because they were seen as less desirable than alcohol. Of course, now we know alcohol is actually far more addictive and far more toxic than these other substances. But in the 1920s, with reefer madness and things like that, it was, if you smoke marijuana, you will crash your car, you will kill your date, you will rape people, you will burn buildings to the ground, it will cause orgies, and the way they depicted it was so far out of whack. It doesn't, in modern terms, make any sense. Of course, to people at the time, they would have seen that and thought it was credible. A government-sponsored, a business-sponsored in reality, but the government wants you to see this, and if you smoke marijuana, you will die. You will become a drug-addicted beatnik street bum. And that's the way it was portrayed. And then later on, it moved through the 40s, 60s, 80s, all these other periods, and they kept changing the rhetoric. Because every time they launched anti-pop propaganda, they were rebuffed later on by people who realized they were wrong. People eventually realized that marijuana would not cause you to kill your date, crash your car, and have a wild orgy. They realized that wasn't true. Fairly early on, people realized it. So then they moved to, well, it's immoral. It causes you to be lazy. It causes you to be jobless. It causes homelessness. It causes, during the eugenics movement, these were major issues. And so people, clammed up about marijuana then. And it was shown later on in the 60s that that wasn't true. Then in the 60s, they said, well, it's a gateway drug. It causes you, pot on its own might not, well, this was more 80s. 80s was sort of the Reagan era, gateway drugs were big. They said, well, marijuana on its own might not be too terrible. It's still addictive, it's still not good, and it's still going to remain illegal. But on its own, it's not that bad, but it causes you to smoke crack. It causes you to shoot heroin. And of course, now, we know that's not true. We know, based on study after study, marijuana has never been a gateway drug. Marijuana, if anything, is the only reason it has a link to hard drugs is because people who do get addicted to crack or to heroin often experience nausea. Many drugs cause you to become nauseous. Well, the greatest way to get rid of nausea is marijuana. In medical cases, which are now well regarded in most of the medical community, marijuana is considered very good, or other cannabinoid compounds derived from it are considered very good at suppressing nausea and increasing appetite. Well, if you're strung out on crack or meth, you probably are losing weight. You probably are shiftless, and you do have various medical problems. They start smoking marijuana as a way to ease those problems so they can live a more marginally normal life. It's not a gateway. If anything, hard drugs are a gateway to marijuana use. And at this point, more than half the population has tried marijuana. I would be willing to admit that the number is far higher. I think that more than 3/4 of people in this country have tried marijuana, and that they simply don't say yes on these surveys because they still fear persecution. I think the vast majority of Americans, and probably people throughout most of the Western world, have tried marijuana. I think a lot of them have also tried psychedelics, but that's a totally different issue. Marijuana is sort of in a class of its own. It's probably the most medically relevant entheogen that you can think of. It does have an established now medical use. Here's what I find funny. Every time the propaganda fails, they move to new propaganda. Now the gateway drug has been completely discredited, and even the youth, which usually takes whatever it's told and runs with it, understands that it's not true. Now their new tactic is simply pot will make you ugly, pot will give you man boobs, pot will make you, you'll become fat or whatever. This is just the next level of propaganda. It's sad to see it on the media, but this is the next wave. Of course, they can't get away with saying that pot is highly toxic, highly addictive, causes all these crimes, because people know that it doesn't. So now this is their new propaganda. And I find it funny, the hypocrisy here. It's legal now in Washington State and Colorado, marijuana is. It's probably going to become legal here in Vermont fairly quickly. Shumlin has already said he intends to legalize it or decriminalize it. I can't remember which one. So it'll be legal for use here fairly soon. And you don't see an uptick in crime in these states. And that scares the people who run the for-profit private prisons in this country. It scares the paper manufacturers because marijuana is, well, the hemp plant, which is also illegal for no reason, provides a very high-quality paper for a lower cost. It would drive these pulp paper manufacturers out of business. It's a biofuel derivative. You can derive biofuel from it. It scares people in many industries. It scares people in the alcohol industry. They're worried. They shouldn't worry them because a lot of people who smoke weed also drink, and they pair the two together for whatever reason. I never found that to be particularly alluring. I thought they blurred out each other's effects and made it less pronounced, but some people like to do that anyway. Tobacco manufacturers, they're worried people smoke pot instead of tobacco. So you have all of these industries stacked against legalization. But in the states where it's already legal and in countries where it's been deregulated, people aren't just magically starting to smoke more weed. People aren't, the usage isn't increasing. It's not causing more crime. It's actually emptying out the prisons. If California were to legalize marijuana and let people go who were just imprisoned for nonviolent offenses, they wouldn't have a prison overcrowding problem. And that worries people who run prisons because there are a lot of prisons in this country that are businesses. They are for profit. They get hired, contracted by the government to operate prisons. Well, if they have fewer people in the prisons, they're getting less money. And if marijuana is ever fully legalized, you can look for them to crack down on some other aspect of life and make something else illegal that shouldn't be illegal to replace the prison population. You can look for that. They'll do it. Back during alcohol prohibition, they had a lot of people in prison. Of course, back then, people would often simply not convict people who were actually on trial for moonshining and stuff because for some reason they had respect for them in certain communities, especially in parts of Appalachia. They thought they were pillars of the community for standing up against the man, sort of in a neo-Confederate manner. But really, at this point, it's been legalized in several states. It's going to be legalized most likely this year or next in several more states by ballot initiative or whatever. Here in Vermont, it's likely. New Hampshire, it's likely. Maine. I think there are a couple of other states. California, it may be legalized fairly soon. It's getting to the point where the propaganda gets a little bit old. Yes, is marijuana a great, perfect substance that has no side effects? Of course not. It does make people potentially more lazy. It does make people potentially eat more. This doesn't mean that the chemical itself causes people to grow man boobs and get lazy and so forth. It's just a lifestyle. And for every worthless stoner that really does just sit on their couch all day eating nachos and Twinkies and smoking weed, there are medical marijuana patients who honestly need the pain relief that it gives and shouldn't be relegated to just using morphine, which is also a drug and far more dangerous. There are people who have tried marijuana and not really used it again. Some of these people end up in jail. It might be their first time fucking using it. And people who may use it regularly, but they live a normal life. And I don't use marijuana. I don't even particularly like being around people using marijuana. But to continue to keep it illegal and to put millions and millions of people in prison, which drains the economy when you put them in a government-run prison and generates a huge amount of profit for the dishonest for-profit prison industry, makes no sense. There are no reliable studies showing that marijuana really hurts anybody at all. The only time that it hurts people is when it is illegal and when people end up getting thrown in jail. In some states, they have 3-strike rules and things like this. You can go to jail for life for your third felonious drug offense. You know, Jimmy's 22. He got in trouble for larceny a couple times. Well, he's going to prison for life because he had a joint in his pocket. This makes no sense whatsoever. It makes no sense. And they continue the media because it gets big money from the government. It gets big money from certain states which don't want marijuana legal. Guess what? The states that really don't want it legal are states like North Carolina and Virginia, which have the tobacco industry. Parts of the western areas that have a large lumber industry because the pulp paper. And California, there's a lot of resistance to it. Number one, because of the for-profit prisons. And number two, because of biofuels. And in the areas of the Midwest as well, they sell corn for ethanol. Well, you can derive better biofuel, which is far more effective and efficient, out of marijuana, out of hemp. Well, hemp's still illegal. Hemp isn't even a drug. Hemp isn't even, you can't use it. It probably does contain some THC. Nobody's going to start smoking it. It wouldn't make any sense to do so. So marijuana at this point, really, it should be just simply, all the laws regarding it should be done away with. My thought is there's also hypocrisy that if you were to smoke a joint in Oregon, 5 feet away from the border, you could get arrested and thrown in jail for 10 years for smoking a joint. You walk across the border into Washington State and it's A-OK and nothing's wrong. If you're in Oregon, it's a highly addictive, highly toxic, terrible substance that will ruin your life and cause you to crash cars and have orgies. But if you walk 10 feet from there into Washington State, suddenly it's A-OK. And I've pointed this out about other substances too, like peyote, or any mescaline-containing substance, psilocybin mushrooms, certain other psychedelics. If you're a Native American and you're living on a reservation, you can use these things without incident. And it's fine. It's perfectly healthy. It's spiritual. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a tradition. But if you go off the reservation and use these same substances, suddenly you're ruining your life. You're a criminal. You're an addict. You're a terrible person. And I've pointed this out too. There's a difference between drug use and drug abuse. There are people who do get addicted to substances and habitually use them, and they can ruin their lives in doing this. The answer is not to put them in prison, where the first thing that they'll do when they get out is look for another fix. The proper thing to do is get them therapy. Get them into recovery so they can break the addiction. And for a substance like marijuana, who cares if they get addicted to it? It's not going to cost them any more than tobacco. It's not going to ruin their life any more than tobacco. Its effects generally aren't even any greater than the effects of tobacco. Actually, it's probably healthier for them to get addicted to pot. Yet tobacco's legal. As long as they're 18 and they can show ID, they can smoke themselves into a stupor. They can shove a whole pack in their mouth, light it with a blowtorch, and kill themselves and have a massive stroke. And it's legal to do that. But if they light up a joint, it's illegal. It doesn't make sense. If keeping pot illegal is about preventing people from becoming addicts, then you've got to go after tobacco and alcohol. If it's about going after a substance that's toxic, you have to go after tobacco and alcohol. If it's about all of these industries, then it makes sense, finally, why they're only targeting marijuana. Because they don't want these industries to experience competition, which will likely drive them out of business. If you're growing hemp, hemp can grow a lot more easily, a lot more quickly, with a higher yield, less fertilizer, and less damage to the soil than farming for paper from trees. It's a lot easier, and it's a hell of a lot better than clear cutting. It's far better for biofuel. There are all sorts of benefits to marijuana for those who choose to use it for medical purposes or industrial purposes. So that's the reason why it's illegal, and that's the reason it was illegal to begin with. I've heard, I can't confirm this, that the first cars that Ford built were actually meant to be driven on hemp oil. Now, can you imagine how much different things would be if instead of worrying about oil in the Middle East, we simply raised hemp crops and made our own oil? I don't know if that's true or not, but it sounds like it's possible. People have to give up all this dumb propaganda. You don't have to be a drug user to see through this bullshit. To see that this is dishonest, it's lies, it doesn't really make sense. And they're playing on the naivete of the general population, of the soccer moms and people like that in the suburbs. These people are naive if they actually think that marijuana is going to cause little Jimmy to become a dropout addict. It's just not going to happen. The laws really need reform. 3 strikes has to go, for one thing. And for another thing, when you see these media articles, you can tell this is the same thing as reefer madness. It's just been modernized for a new audience because nobody anymore believes, yes, if you smoke marijuana, you'll act like these people in reefer madness. You'll drive your car off a cliff. You'll burn down your parents' home and have a wild orgy while the skin melts off your skull. You're going to rob banks to feed your addiction. That lost credibility even almost as the movie itself was made. And now one thing people do is actually watch Reefer Madness while high, which is hilarious. And it's the same as the whole acid craze thing. People said, well, if you take LSD, you'll stare at the sun until your eyes melt out of their sockets. Well, this was based on faulty reporting, and the story actually was never true. It never actually happened. It became a cautionary tale to tell to people because people were worried that these hippies, they're out of work, they're on the streets, they're acting like communists. We've got to protect Jesus Nation. So essentially, pot remains illegal now in most states. But magically, people living in Colorado or Washington State, they're somehow magically immune to negative health effects from it. They can smoke as much pot as they want, and it doesn't cause any problems because it was made legal there, so magically they're okay. But the second they step across the border, if they light up, they lose that magical ability to smoke marijuana without massive health effects. Their lungs will fall out. They'll become hardcore criminals. They'll start getting all sorts of tattoos and piercings. This doesn't make any sense. Yeah, there are people that honestly do waste their lives on marijuana. It's a very small subset of the population. Most people, they smoke it to relax or whatever. Or they're smoking it for pain relief. It does have a medical use. It's been established. The medical community has already come out as saying, why is this substance still illegal, at least for medical use? You've got a cancer patient. They're going to fucking die anyway. Why are you dosing them up with morphine? That's a precursor to heroin. I thought heroin was worse. I thought marijuana was a gateway drug to all these worse hard drugs. They never truly explain this, why morphine remains legal in a medical setting and pot doesn't. They crack down on dispensaries. Obama comes out and says, well, we're not going to crack down on these things anymore. Where it's already legal, we'll respect the state's right to make it legal. And yet they're still cracking down on dispensaries in Montana. Here in Vermont, they're opening up dispensaries right now, pending laws by the governor to legalize it. I bet that they'll try to crack down here too. If they try that here, they're likely to get shot at, especially since I believe one of the dispensaries is up in the Northeast Kingdom. people up there are very heavily armed and really don't like the government. So it'd be interesting to see if that happens. Essentially, the substance should have been legalized years ago. The fucking president smoked pot and admits it. And Bill did too, and he did inhale. Anyone who doesn't believe that doesn't understand reality. I know marijuana truly ruined the lives of the Beatles. They became dropout homeless bums that never made a dollar in their life. You look at some of the people that admit to have smoked pot, and you look at their lives and you say, well, I guess it didn't really ruin their lives. Tom Petty seems to be doing pretty well. That's about all. Peace out.